Marketing and Business Development. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Mantec and World Trade Center Harrisburg have partnered together today to bring this special presentation to you. And as kind of heard, we have 79 now participants. We truly were overwhelmed with the great response for this. Those of you that heard the banter before we're starting here, we're confident you're going to leave this presentation with lots of information. I think entertained as well between David and Dennis here, and that you'll have some ideas of how to proceed and how Mantec and World Trade Center will help be able to make those connections for you. Our speakers are committed and passionate about this topic. You're going to find that quickly, as we did in our practice yesterday. They've allotted 1 hour for the presentation, but they are committed and promised to stay on until all questions are answered. Feel free to ask questions using the chat feature at any time. We're going to monitor that because they want this to be conversational, to make sure that as those questions come up, that if it's timely, that we'll answer them at that same time. So not waiting all the way to the end, but we will, of course, at the end as well. We are recording today's session, and the slides are going to be available after today as well. In addition, we have some happy news to share that our presenters are putting together a series of free materials that they're going to be providing to us as it comes out, and we of course will share this with our registrants as we receive it. So with that, I'm going to ask Tina Wyatt from World Trade Center Harrisburg to introduce our speakers.
Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce our two presenters this morning. Dennis Unkovic is a partner at Meyer, Unkovic and Scott, a Pittsburgh-based law firm of over 60 attorneys handling a wide variety of business transactions, corporate litigation, and technology and intellectual property matters. His work has taken him to over 64 countries with particular emphasis on the Pacific Rim. And David Iwinski has worked in international business management in Asia and Europe for over 31 years. He is currently the managing director of Blue Water Growth, a global merger and acquisitions advisory firm. He is an attorney by training, and Mr. Iwinski spent 4 years with Respironics, living in Hong Kong, managing director for their China and Southeast Asia operations. So please welcome our two presenters, and with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'll start. I'm Dennis Unkovic. I want to thank Leanne and Mantec. I'd also like to thank Tina and World Trade Center Harrisburg. It's really wonderful to be here this morning. Over the last 6 weeks, we've given some form of this presentation to about 1,000 companies in our general region. We're really honored to be with you today. This isn't going to be your typical, I'm going to read the slides to you and why don't you listen. It's going to be a conversation between David Iwinski and myself. Briefly, our bios are on the screen. You can read them if you want. Basically, what you need to know is that my first trip to China was in 1985, 1986. Been back there about 65 times since then. A lot of what I do is doing business in and around Asia, and that's my background. I've written a couple of books. 2 of them are on the screen. The most recent one, Asia Ascending, talks about how important Asia is to world trade. Now, let me turn to David Iwinski. David and I have known each other, I think, for 30 years. David has worked for 3 global companies, one in transportation, Siemens, another one in medical equipment, which is now owned by Philips, and then another one in transcription. David has lived in China for 7 years, has worked extensively throughout Asia, and has probably spent a year of his life in India with one of his companies. So that's our background. We're not here to talk about ourselves. What we want to do is, in the next couple of minutes, let's say in the first 15 to 20 minutes, we're going to tell you an interesting story that we think will explain why we are where we are today and what you think we ought to do about it. David, let me turn it to you, and why don't you give a quick run through as to what we're going to cover in the next hour.
Sure. So I would just echo Dennis's sentiments. It's really a pleasure to be here and to share this information. If you have questions, we'll stick around and answer whatever you'd like to know. What we're going to do is start off with a sequence of events. Some of these I think will be known to you, but some of them will not. And these events were things that came to us actually all the way back on February 6th, long before the Commonwealth was in its situation of reducing social interaction. And we saw sort of what we think of as sort of a bunch of dominoes that had implications. And we'd like to share those and then talk about what the outcome was. And then at the end, figure out some strategies for coping with this. The worst part of this, we suspect, on the business community is yet to come. And that's one of the reasons we're so passionate about this. I think that there is a kind of a perception that, you know, boy, as soon as we get back to work, things will spin up, crisis will be kind of over. We have a month or two to get back to normalcy. But as you'll see, we have reasons for believing there are much greater issues that are coming by, and this is our sequence. So I think I'll start with the first point in all this, which is the healthcare crisis. We all know about this. It's been reported on a daily basis, supplanted now only by the current social issues in the United States, but this has been front page news now for 6 months. These numbers updated this morning, 6 million cases, 3 million active, a global 377 deaths affecting everywhere on the planet. The only thing I'll say about this before we move off of this information is that these numbers are, in my opinion, deceptively low. In fact, very low. One point of comparison is that if you take the numbers officially reported, you would believe that the United States had 106,000 deaths and China had a little over 5,000. That is implausible in the extreme. The notion that the United States had about 30% of global fatalities and all the other places, given the healthcare systems that they have and the population density that they have accounted for the rest, not possible. So this is still ongoing, and I think that some awareness of this plays into the entire supply chain issue. But nonetheless, hopefully, this part of the equation is starting to slowly sort itself out. But this led to some issues, and I think Dennis and I are going to.
David, let me jump in here because we're going to be talking about factories in China. And the factories in China and Asia are not the kind of factories that you think of. David ran a factory in China of 2,000 people making, unbelievably now with what's going on, surgical masks, which he can tell you more about later. But a factory in China basically has, obviously the factory is probably 4 or 5 stories, concrete slab, but then behind it, there's a second building. In that second building, what are you going to see? In the second building, you're going to see a dormitory, and not a Holiday Inn Express, but a concrete building, probably with 5 or 6 stories, levels of bunk beds. And you don't always get your own bunk bed, but you get to sleep there during a certain time. There's another building back there, which is essentially provides you with what? Food. It's like a cafeteria. There's another building in the back for recreation, ping pong, pool, soccer, and then there might be a small area here where they have medical help when people have health. So essentially, when we talk about a factory, it's not what you would imagine in Lancaster County or York or Dauphin County. It is a miniature city. And in China, and let's take the Pearl River Delta, which is near Hong Kong. It's 90 million people. It includes Guangzhou and Shenzhen. There are tens of thousands of these kinds of factories. And these are the kind of factories we're going to be talking about now. And normally they shut down at the end of a year, at the beginning of a year. Dave, why don't you tell them how Chinese New Year works? Because as you and I know, this coronavirus could not have come at a worse time.
So there's this kind of idea that, you know, why the dormitories? You know, I mean, can't people just commute to work on buses or bicycles or cars or whatever? And the reality is that, as Dennis Unkovic coined the phrase, there's rich China, poor China. Rich China is coastal and manufacturing intense, and everywhere else is poor. So the workers that are in these factories don't come from the local community. They don't come from across the street. They come from 800, 1,000, 2,000 miles away. And so they work, they live in the dorms, and we provide everything, food, water, shelter. But during Chinese New Year, that's the one time of the year where everybody goes home. Everybody. we would be down to 3 to 10% of our factory workers that would stay. And every year, a certain percentage wouldn't come back. But the reason for this is that the Chinese New Year Spring Festival holiday is sort of like 4th of July, Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving, all rolled into one. And as my wife is a Chinese lady, you celebrate what's called reunion dinner. And so that's sort of a Thanksgiving kind of ceremony. Everybody has to be there. So the factories empty out. And it's an extraordinary migration. And the way I kind of describe it to my American friends who have not been through it is, imagine that between Christmas and New Year's, everybody east of the Mississippi decides they're going to go to LA, and everybody west of the Mississippi decides to go to Boston. So they do. Hundreds upon hundreds of millions of bus rides, train rides, plane rides, car rides. It's mind-blowing. And they stay at home for about a week because it normally takes them 3 to 4 days to get home. And then they all go back. And so this extraordinary migration happens every year. And what happened this year, however, was a timing issue that is, in my opinion, just unparalleled, and it's bad timing. The Chinese chose to impose their quarantine right in the middle of Chinese New Year. If they had done it a week before, everybody would have been stuck in the factories. They would have quarantined at work and then gone back to work. If they'd waited another week, they would have already been back. And the second worst part is, wherever the virus started, Wuhan is the number one suspect, the people in the factories there that had the early cases, because it was out and about as of, we think, October, November, they were now carrying it all over the country, mixing with people. And so right in the middle of all this is when they called this quarantine. And the quarantine put enormous restrictions, 780 million people. And
Dave, well, let me just add one thing. You're probably saying, why do these people travel? It's very simple. Along the coast is rich China, and there you make a certain amount of money. If you live in the central part of China, if you make $5 an hour on the coast, you make $1 an hour on the inside. And so a lot of younger people between 18 and usually 30 or 35, travel, live in these dorms for essentially 12 months a year because they want to make money. They can make 4 or 5 times what they can in staying in their homes. That's why you have, as David has on the screen here now, 780 million people, we're traveling back and forth. And as David said, that couldn't have happened at a worse time. And so as a result, David, when you ran your factory, did everyone come back after the new year?
You would get 85% on a good year, 80 on a bad year. They'd had enough. They decided to stay home and didn't come back.
But what happened this year, Dave?
Well, so these people are all quarantined, and there's no unemployment insurance. They don't get paid for this time. It's forced holiday. And now they're trapped. Weeks and weeks turn into months. And they can't get back to the factories, number one, and they still have to eat. So they start taking local jobs. They adapt, some of them 2 jobs to replace the factory employment. But they're really hustling in their local area. And that means that instead of the factories, after a week and a half, getting 80, 85% back, maybe 90, now they're getting 40% back, 30%. And again, these numbers come not just from our experience, but I spend about 3 hours a night on these kind of Zoom and Skype videos with China and have been doing it for years. Certainly that has picked up a lot since February. So all of a sudden, they've got a factory that's got 60% of the people not there. And they have to find them and they have to train them. And those of you that are, many of the people I know in this call are running manufacturing, imagine you come back from Christmas and New Year's and, instead of 100 people, you've got 35 or 40. Instead of 1,000, you've got, a couple hundred. But every one of those factories, Dennis said, you can drive on an 8-lane highway for 8 hours, horizon to horizon. Every brand, every factory you've ever dreamt of is right there. They're all going through this at the same time. So they're hiring dang near anybody. If you got a pulse, you got a job. But then how do you get them trained? Because China 30 years ago was simple assemblies, trimming the flash off of crappy plastic molds. No more. Now we're doing iPhones. We're doing sophisticated electronics. The jobs take more skill, more knowledge, more cognition. And in many cases, the people that were going to train the new workers, because you still had to train 15% anyway, they weren't there anyway. They were locked back in their home city. So you really had this.
Dave, my mother's older brother was an expert welder. He was like the king of welders, and he trained people to weld, and that was really his career after he was a welder. But if he had someone come to him and say, "Can you teach me how to be a welder?" He'd say, "Oh yeah, it'll take about 18 months, but I'll make you a world-class welder." And so if he wasn't there to train, no one would train. And a lot of the jobs that were now empty were, as you said, weren't assembling pieces. I have grandkids, Happy Meal toys that you put together, and the kids love them more than the food, which isn't hard. So anyway, I'm sorry. Let me turn it back to you.
Well, Dennis hit it right on the head. The new workers aren't as fast. They're not as good. And there aren't enough of them. You put all that together in a factory, quality suffers, output suffers. And so the Chinese factories that were facing this, particularly down in Guangzhou and Shenzhen, they are really scrambling. So what starts to happen is they can't ship product. It means they can't get paid. They start to run into severe working capital and liquidity issues, because the model there is you ship a lot of product before Chinese New Year. You have 2 to 3 weeks slow productivity, transit, people get back, start up the factory again. But then you want to start shipping because you want to start billing. Now they're not billing for months. And when they do get back, and some of the people are released from quarantine, the volumes are down, the quality's bad. They really don't have the same access to capital, and liquidity, again, has been eroded a lot over the last decades. So they've got a real crisis on their hands and are just hanging on.
One other thing to add in there, whether you're a fan of Donald Trump or not, David and I split on this, but one of the things that his tariffs did is they put tremendous pressure on Chinese companies, where they essentially, working on a very narrow margin before, when the tariffs were put on, a lot of them were working at cost and some at below cost in order to supply it. So after 18 months of this, when the Spring Festival came about and they went home, and then there was a financial problem, it wasn't just a problem for the workers. The companies themselves, the smaller companies, just didn't have the capital to continue. Dave.
Yeah. So these problems start to flow overseas. We saw it sometimes in shortages here. They were masked somewhat by the belief that all of those shortages were based on panic buying in the face of our own isolation regimens. But the reality is that the factories did not go back to work. Those that did go back had low volumes and low quality. They ran into these problems, and it starts to create problems here. And we did ourselves have a real shock to our stock market a couple months ago. Dennis and I both ended up on television doing some interviews about that and why this is. And so it's a reflection of this crisis in China. This crisis is not over, by the way. So all of these problems are now starting to flow in our direction. And just at that moment, and I tell you, I spend 3 hours, 4 hours a night on video with this. My friends in China are saying, like, man, we're hanging on by our fingernails. We really need you to start buying. You know, whatever the political rhetoric is, you know, with Trump and Xi Jinping, the reality is down at the ground level, they're very, very aware that we are the #1 market. We are the buyer of last resort. And they needed us to start buying and sending money. So they're just hanging on. And just about the time that they're hoping we save them, we start shutting down state by state, region by region, non-essential businesses. And even if we didn't, shipping completely closed for quite a while, no sea boxes on the ocean. and everything in the air was going for masks, sanitizer, ventilators. The prices on air shipping, if you went back to November, you can get a 747 for a single flight, Shanghai to LA, probably around 186,000. Now that plane is $2 million for the same flight. Why? Demand. So just as they needed us the most, we shut down. And this really was the hammer blow. All these little things happening in sequence, but there were some other things as well. This was like kind of the last straw in decades of changes. Dennis, you want to grab some of these? Because
Yeah, COVID-19 was a problem and is a problem, but it was not just the only problem. The Chinese have a very serious debt crisis that you don't read about. They have a housing bubble where they literally have millions of apartments and houses they built that are not being filled. Their unemployment, which we'll get to in a minute, dropped precipitously. Those of you who have been to China know that you need more than a mask. You need essentially a respirator when you go to parts of China in the summer because it's so bad. We've talked about Trump and his tariff wars. And so all of these things essentially hit at one time. And there's also political unrest. In the western part of China, they have the indigenous people, the more Asian, some of them are called the Uyghurs. The Chinese are having problems there. And so when this happened, it became February. And pick it up there, Dave, because I think we want to move into this because people sort of understand what we'll be saying, but what happened then?
Well, I also though want to mention, because it's part of the narrative, while China has been doing its thing for the last 35 years, the rest of Southeast Asia has been watching and learning fast. Long before COVID, our firm was helping companies move out of China into Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. Why? Because they're very good now. They've gone beyond shirts and shoes into electronics and sophisticated assemblies. So this all accelerated under Trump. And if you want to see a lot of MAGA hats, go to Malaysia and Thailand these days, because their mindset is that Trump cracked open the China, dominance on manufacturing. So again, this is bleeding China as all of this stuff we've discussed to this moment comes. So what we predicted back in February 6th, we sent out a company newsletter. We kind of wrote these sequences down and said, it's going to get really bad in China. And Dennis and I got a lot of fear-mongering.
We were the doom mongers. We were saying, look, you're going to go to your local stores, your grocery stores, and you're going to go to Walmart. You're going to find there are going to be empty shelves. This is back in February. People said, that's ridiculous. That isn't really going to happen, because obviously we could never have empty shelves in America. David?
And then it starts to happen. So in April, a blogger leaked out that there was a documentation of 247,000 Chinese companies went bankrupt January, February. That's early in the crisis. Now, this is the blogger that only writes in Mandarin. He's reliable but obscure. And even when we shared this, people were saying, well, come on, that's just a dissident. Okay, maybe, but let's just say at this rate, this bankruptcy rate is 6,400 times higher than American bankruptcy for the same period of time. But then what happens? South China Morning Post, a couple weeks afterwards,
which is the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times. It is the most famous and reliable non-political paper in Hong Kong. What did it say?
Close to 500,000 companies closed. Now, this is close on 10,000% higher than American closure rates. And this is a reputable company, newspaper. And the firms that were normally registering to, there's a little creative destruction involved. New companies rise up. They fell by 30%. So this is just first quarter. I'm highly confident as of this moment, this total number is probably closer to 900,000, approaching 1 million companies already gone. And yes, just to be clear, many of them were probably print shops and mom and pop restaurants and delivery services and shoe stores. fair enough, but not all of them. And let's know, we can't be naive. We know of factories that are already closed, already padlocked. By the way, some of them still invoicing customers, but still not operational. And then it gets even worse because the China government was still not admitting this. I mean, they really weren't. They were keeping quiet and actually defaming the South China Morning Post. They finally, on April 20th, announced, and this is a report that is normally in English and Chinese. It only came out in Chinese this year. They finally showed a contraction. Now, just to put this in perspective, the Chinese government have not reported a contraction since 1976, the year Mao died. Mao destroyed the economy, destroyed the country, but from his death onward, it's been rocket ship upwards for 44 years until now. And so, and let's be very blunt. They stretched this number because if they reported 9.8, it wouldn't shock me at all if it were 15 or 18, because they're going to try to make this as good as they can. Second quarter numbers not out yet. They're going to be worse.
Oh, by the way, the Chinese announced 4 days ago that normally the Chinese central government will say, we project our growth for the next 3 months or the next year will be X. The projections have never been less than 6% growth per year, because from like 1981 through essentially 3 years ago, China grew between 6 and 12 to 13%. All right. They announced 5 days ago that because of they called it the disruptions in the world economy, that they will not make a prediction for 2020 and maybe not after that because of how serious this is. And so when you see a 9.8% contraction, the US economy during the first quarter of this year contracted about 4.6%, about half of what the Chinese did. Now, Dave, before we go on, what we want to talk about is finished goods here. I'm holding up here, I'm sort of old. I have an iPhone 6. The iPhone 6, which was made in 2016 to 18, was the most advanced phone at its time. Why do I hold it up? The reason is it's made of 32 component parts, which come from 11 different countries. 8 of the component parts come from China where it's assembled, but all of the rest of them come from 10 other countries around the world. This is the concern that we have, is that people who have companies who rely on component parts, depending on where they come from, are going to see a real shortage in the future. And as a result, this will prevent them from creating finished goods. And essentially, the best example I can give is by General Motors. General Motors wanted to ramp up after having been closed for a month. So they decided the most profitable thing that they could do would be to sell trucks for individuals. So they decided to reopen plants and to double the size of the capacity. They had to call it off last week because the component parts, which came from outside the United States, weren't there. Dave?
So this is the issue. A lot of these companies in China are closed. We know that some of them are even now telling U.S. manufacturers that are waiting on those C cargo boxes to be unloaded in Long Beach, telling them that, it's really tough now. Raw material is hard to get, which is true. If you want to go to the head of the line, prepay. And some Americans are doing it. They're prepaying into factories that are already padlocked. And if you've got something that's readily available in Europe or Latin America, or there's a lot of safety stock, maybe this is a storm you can weather. If you've got material that comes from one particular plastic injection mold, it's already possibly gathering dust and rust. And replacing that capacity, not so easy. And again, as you folks know, you're experts in this, you can have everything, you can build a Ferrari, but if you don't have a steering wheel, you're not selling that car and it isn't moving off the lot. And for some people, it's also the upstream effect. I've talked to some companies that say, well, I'm very, vertically integrated. I'm not that worried. Okay, that may be true. Maybe you're like the Ford Rose River plant where you iron your own iron, you dig your own iron ore and smelt your own metal. Maybe, but if your customers that buy your subcomponents, if you make transmissions, if the people that make the cars don't get the stuff they need, then they're not going to buy from you, even if you are independent. We think that this is going to be a real crisis. We think it's going to be extremely tumultuous for the next 3 to 5 years, to be quite honest. Our supply chains are thin, so we've got some recommendations.
Now, Dave, before you take the next slide, let me transition people. For the last 20 or 25 minutes, we've tried to explain to you what happened in China, how it rolled into Europe, and how it rolled into the United States, and basically the economic problems that are there. I think most of you are on the call today because you recognize there's a problem, or you may have a concern. What we want to do is we want to spend the next 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes with you, basically talking about what you can do or what you should look for in your companies to try to get ahead of this curve, because we think the economic problems that are coming as a result of the supply chain breakdown, I call it fractionalization, but as it breaks down, are going to be equally as serious as the health problems that the U.S. has encountered over the last 4 to 5 months. So on the screen now, you're going to see our 3 recommendations. We're going to go through them one by one, and at the end, we're going to prescriptively, give you some ideas about what we think you might want to do. Dave, you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. So to start with, forecasts of recovery from China, be pessimistic. It's possible that the people that supply you with components and parts are A-OK and back at work. I know many that are. But if you're getting slow deliveries, if you're getting product quality that doesn't match your expectations, it isn't necessarily the case that it's going to get better. These problems we documented at the beginning, they're still ongoing. And not to mention, there was just literally a headline that came across my phone while Dennis was talking that 20 states are now reporting a rise in COVID. They've gone back and now it's popping up. I know that's happening in China. I know that because I'm working with people that are importing masks, and masks are being seized at the dock, ostensibly to prevent Americans from getting substandard product. They're big-hearted, looking out for us. They're seizing them because they need them. So I would be pessimistic about these things. And even if you've got people that have their workforce, if they can't get raw materials, they can't produce, and the inspection services are just overwhelmed right now.
David, let me pick up the next thing. We think, first of all, let me say, I hope I'm not quoted on this too much, but you can't believe any of the statistics or the information coming out of China. I don't think that the Chinese will be telling you seriously where they are. And so when you look at official statistics, if anything, they're going to be on the lower end of the schedule. But as companies, the first thing or the second thing we think you need to do, and later we're going to give you specific steps, but in like a 30,000 foot looking down, we think that you should look at your customer base. If you have, let's say 100 customers, but if you have 5 or 10 of those customers that give you 70 or 80% of your profits or your sales, you might want to focus on making them as happy as possible and seeing how you can supply them. Because we think, as we'll show later, you're going to end up with fewer component parts, number one. And a lot of the component parts, particularly those coming from China, for the reasons we've already described, the quality may not be right. Because there's no point in putting a defective part in something, because in the end it's going to come back and cause you more things. And so we think you may want to reduce your shipments to your customers, or at least confine them to the customers that are most valuable to the operation of your business. Secondly, if you've probably already done this, but if you haven't, if you have component parts that you use in your operations, you should go out as quickly as you can and look for available safety stock. I think one of the interesting things Dave said a few minutes ago is the 747, which you used to be able to fill up with stuff for cargo from essentially Shanghai to San Francisco, would cost you $250,000 for a plane load. It's now $2 million. And so a lot of the safety stock, even if you can get it, is going to come here and going to be more expensive. As far as payment terms, are your customers paying you now as they do, net 40, net 60, 30, whatever it is? If your customers are slowing down their payments to you, then maybe you need to conserve your capital as you pay your suppliers. One other thing, we have noticed that there are companies in China that we understand from people we've spoken to are not now in business, but as David alluded to before, they're sending out invoices and they're trying to collect money. And we'll talk later about how you go and deal directly with those suppliers. But you need to have a careful handle on not just payments coming into you, but the payments going out. So David, that sounds like common sense, and I guess it is common sense, but I think a lot of companies are underestimating the need for capital they're going to have going forward. Dave?
Yeah. And, you know, the third point in all of this, which we're going to spend some additional detail time on, is we think there's going to be a large-scale simultaneous supply chain realignment. And this is not, I mean, we've been talking about it in context of COVID and in China, but let's be blunt. There is right now a political national element to this as well.
Hi.
And so for lots of
Dr.
reasons,
Taylor was here today.
lots of things have
earlier.
the potential for looking at realignment. And some of the work that some of you may do, and by the way, this is also a customer issue as well. Some of this may be moving to other countries, some of it bringing it back to the United States. On the realignment side, at the very least, we recommend that you diversify within China. We had a client last year that was doing $100 million worth of product, basically out of one factory in northern China. What we did there is we split that into two, and then we took half of that volume and went to Malaysia. But at the very least, you know, that's just good practice. And I'd like to just have a small side note. Part of the reason that we're in this problem is I trace some of it all the way back to, you know, 35 years ago in Jack Welch and GE. The rise of financial analysis to maximize earnings, particularly quarter to quarter, to narrow the supply chains. The idea for 35 years has been super lean, super narrow. If you can get a tenth of a penny off of a component, you do it. Those numbers look good, and Wall Street has rewarded them. Private equity has rewarded them. Venture capital rewarded them. And they vastly underestimated risk. So people being driven by what's happening in the financial market said, fine, we will do that. And you give more volume to one supplier, your prices do go down. But now you really got a risk issue that has not until now been allocated and accounted for, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So then to get out of China, because maybe it's not
By
a
the
US
way, Dave, it's not just small companies and making mistakes. Apple has made an enormously big bet on China. We talked about the iPhone a few minutes ago. A lot of their manufacturing and their assemblies being done in China. I predict that the political relationship between China and the United States will not get better. In fact, I think it's going to get worse over the next 9 to 12 months. Now, whether President Trump is right or not doing this, we all can debate it. But I do not think that the China-US relationship will improve. And so if all of your supplies are coming out of China, I think you are at an extreme risk. Dave?
And Dennis is right. I agree on the political side. I mean, I've been going to China for 33 years, and I've worked in the place. I like the people, not a big fan of the government. But both of the leaders of these two nations are doubling down. China had an opportunity to back off and be a little more flexible on Hong Kong. They didn't. The iron fist is coming down. Trump had a chance to say, well, it's their country. They have to govern it the way they want. Nope. His fist is coming down too. So I don't see things getting better over the next I would actually go longer than 9 months. But these other places, they're eager for your business. You can get great product, great prices without the political hassle. These places are what China was 30 years ago, except they're far more sophisticated. They've got the benefit of the learning and the watching and the training, and sending their kids to American universities. Diversification is also available in Latin America and Mexico. So if you've got stuff that doesn't, for various reasons, make sense to bring back, look at this and look at it hard. Then reshoring. Dennis, you want to grab this?
We've been telling a very serious story the last 35 or 40 minutes. I think I was interviewed 2 weeks ago on CNBC Power Lunch, and we were talking about this, and Tyler Matheson, who's the host, said, "Wow, this is pretty serious. Do you have anything good to tell?" And I think my answer to him then was, it's the same now. I think the bright side of this story is that in the future, for a variety of reasons, political and economic, a lot of companies which are now producing the majority of their things in China or in Asia are going to reshore back to the US. And so a state like Pennsylvania, particularly central Pennsylvania, which is extremely dynamic in the manufacturing field, I think you're going to see a lot of companies reshoring coming back here. Now, it's going to be a little bit different. There'll be more robotics. And by the way, labor in the US is not the major problem it used to be. It's not that much more expensive than other parts of the world when you include the importance of being close to between your suppliers. And so I am hopeful. Now, this is going to be difficult, and it's probably going to take 3 or 5 years, but I see a significant part of those things now being made in Asia reshoring back to America. And the options that companies, you as companies have is, do you want to build your internal capacity, or do you want to develop alternatives where you can get the materials? And we think that's really the good story that's going to happen to the US. By the way, another big winner in this, I think, is going to be Mexico. As you know, we used to have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is now called the USMCA. Sort of, I call it NAFTA too. But I think a lot of the things that were being made in Asia are essentially, if they're not reshored back here to the United States, they're going to be reshored to Mexico, and to a lesser extent Canada, but particularly Mexico, because the distance between Mexico and the United States is very small. Anything made in Asia has to get on a ship, and if it's light enough, has to get on a plane, and it has to be flown essentially 12, 15,000 miles to get here. And so this is what we see happening. And we're going to tell you now about some things about how you might want to do this and look to where your companies are. But the good news is this, in the long run, will be good for America. David?
So let's talk about some specific steps on getting a handle on this supply chain issue. We've worked ourselves into this box over decades, and I will say this. My mother, I was chatting briefly with Leanne and Tina before the event started. My mom was a nuclear engineer for 44 years, Westinghouse nuclear all the way. And she had a little saying, and I never kind of understood it as well until now. She used to say, money wakes up first. And so what we have from some of our team members that are involved in venture capital, private equity, investment, these are very, very well connected folks on Wall Street. What they're telling us is that what you heard until the last 3 months was always, does your plan maximize earnings? Does it cut costs to the bone? Are you super lean? Are you just in time? Have you pushed everything out of this dang factory you can?
What's your EBITDA? Always EBITDA, right?
Always your EBITDA. Now they're criticizing people that have gone and maximized and said, but wait a minute, if we invest in you, all of our money's at risk because your supply chain is too narrow. They're specifically wanting money in the plan and accepting lower earnings in exchange for risk mitigation. They're waking up to the reality that a great business plan that has maximum EBITDA but huge supply chain risk is actually not a good investment. It's fragile. So we want to give you some specific steps and recommendations to make your companies, because we know many of you are owners that are of your companies, to make your investment less fragile. 5 steps. We start off with assess. And this is not just, you know, when we've talked to people in the past about assessing supply chain, it's normally like, well, do I have the lowest price and is my quality good? Yes, that still needs to be done. This is standard. Look at the financial, look at the operational issues of your suppliers. Where's their geopolitical environment, positive, negative, trending, good for the U.S. relations? What's the regulatory scheme like? What kind of reports and dashboards have you got? How carefully are you really tracking this in real time? I mean, if you're just looking at it once every couple years, you're very susceptible to getting bitten. So systems and processes, how are they evaluated? How are they selected? And this to us, if we think of it as an analogy, this is like, you know, some friends of mine that, you know, once a year go to the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or UPMC, and they say, I want a full day. I want the stress test. I want the blood work. I want the body scan. I want to know everything going on, because only then can I plan what to do, find the problems I've got, address my systemic issues. So the first thing we recommend, highly recommend, is an assessment. Find out where you are.
David, let me jump in for a minute before we go on. I have to say this delicately, but I do have to say it. You can do your own assessment with your own people, or you can do it with folks on the outside. First of all, if you're going to only do it yourself, you don't just want to have the people who are doing your supply chain and inventory, because they may have been doing a marvelous job in the past, and they may have been doing not so marvelous a job. So I think you need to involve the people elsewhere in the company. Obviously, you want the CFO, because the CFO is going to be everywhere. But you want to have people in management who can help make strategic decisions, because there are times when it might be more expensive to do something, but you want to make sure they're there. The other thing is, sometimes you get tough love if you are get the advice from people on the outside. I mean, you could talk to Tina, you know, you could talk to Leanne, you could talk to us, but having a third party involved in the assessment process will sometimes surface things that would not necessarily come up otherwise. And so the slide you see on the screen in front of you now, briefly, I'll talk about it. You need to create dashboards. You need to take actual data as to where you are with your supply chain. Well, I'll tell you this, if you have one supplier supplying you anything from China, you're at a great risk. At a minimum, as David said a few minutes ago, get at least a second supplier in China. Our advice would be get a second supplier somewhere who is not in China. Now, whether they're in Southeast Asia, whether they're in Mexico, or frankly, maybe even better in the US, that's what you ought to do. But you need to create processes beyond that. I'm holding up a pen here. Okay, I need a refill for this pen. Let me order 5 refills. Okay, I've done my job. That's not it. Do you have the right refill? Is it being produced by someone who can actually supply it? And can you expect it? Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
So once you've got your assessment, you know you've had your checkup. The doc has said, here's the good news, here's the bad news. Then you got your design. This is what I want my health to be like in 3-5 months, 3-5 years. Then the plan part, straight gap analysis. Where am I? Where do I want to be? What's in between? And then prioritization. You know, it used to be prioritization was always about the big ticket items and the big financial hits. But as we've pointed out, and I'm sure you know this in the manufacturing side, small parts that are missing have a big enough impact as the larger parts. So it's really a matter of what's priority, cost benefit. And then we recommend putting this in play in phases. One of the things we have found with some of the folks we've worked with is—
Hey, Dave, why don't you use the example? What if you have 4,000 parts that you need? Now, are you going to be able to take the 4,000 parts and put a plan in place for all of them? No. What would you do?
Yeah, you've got to do some triage, the most vital ones first, and then you'll get bench strength as you work through these. But we have seen people try to fix everything all at once, and that just ends up in chaos. Implementation, very straightforward, very discipline is what's important here. Don't be skipping steps to try to get to the next crisis. And then finally, at the end, it's monitor and control, because we have seen situations where people go through all of this stuff and then they say, woo, glad that's over with. And they go to other things, new product design, opening up new markets, building a factory for expansion, whatever the thing is, make an acquisition. Nothing wrong with all these things. They're great. But if they don't do the monitor and control and watch all these other issues, the problem just resurfaces.
Dave,
So-
let me jump in here on currency, for example. A lot of what you buy now is based upon how much it costs you in US dollars. But a lot of these things, since they're not made in the United States, are subject to currency fluctuations. If you add into currency what we talked about a few minutes ago, the Trump tariffs or any tariffs that are on there, on an ongoing basis, what you actually end up paying, assuming you can get it, can fluctuate a lot. And I really think with the $2 to $3 trillion debt that the Congress has taken on, I think rightfully, to support the US economy. The Europeans at their 2 trillion euro debts, you're going to see governments looking for more money, taxes will change. And so it's why you just can't sit back and say, okay, I know where my things are coming from. It's a reliable supplier. Because at the end of the day, how much is it going to cost you? Dave?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, realignment or reassuring, in our opinion, is the order of the day. You might go through all these steps, assess, design, plan, and find out that everything's rock solid. If so, good. I mean, that's what we want. We want strong Pennsylvania companies. We want a strong Pennsylvania economy. For some people, the issues we've raised today are going to be a crisis. They're going to be realizing that their parts aren't coming, and that 48 cavity mold that's sitting over gathering rust in Shenzhen, you're going to go down to your local machine shop and say, hey, listen, I'd like to whistle up another one of those. Great, 6 to 8 weeks production time. We'll start in 2022 because we're already backed up. See, that's the thing. Time is of the essence on this. We're all going to come to this realization soon enough. And your competitor companies in Ohio and New York and Colorado and Idaho, they're all going to be figuring this out. But capacity is not unlimited. It is not infinitely elastic. So what goes to Vietnam? Vietnam is going to get filled up. In fact, it's already happening. There are lines to get into some of these factories, to be perfectly blunt. And what can come back to the United States? We will need new capacity built, but it will take time. So time is of the essence. Start with the process. Capacity is not unlimited, so I hate to say it, but you want to get in line first, and most definitely work on your risk analysis. And give one last thought on the risk analysis to the risk of your customers and your sub-suppliers. Because if your sub-suppliers can't give you a component that you need, or your customers have this problem and they aren't aware of it, educate them, let them know so that they can incorporate these thoughts. My last comment, and then Dennis, you can have a closing and we can take questions. The good news is that we're going to go through, after a rough time, I think a really good time. I know that if you go back long enough historically, you had the centuries of the Italians and the Spaniards basically doing exploration, and Marco Polo went to China, and the Spanish armadas dominated the ocean, and thankfully they founded this country. Columbus sent over by Queen Isabella, and that's great. And the French for a while had their moment of globalism, and then the British for a while ran the whole planet, and the sun never set on the British Empire. Last century was the American century, and we pulled the world out of a couple of world wars. We put men on the moon. And by the way, if you haven't watched the SpaceX, go find the video. The greatest thing I've seen in a decade was that Americans going back into space on American technology. But the big prediction was this century was going to be the Chinese century. They were going to be ascendant. They were going to dominate the planet. We just have to deal with it. No more. I've been a China fan for a long time. I've been going there since the third week out of law school. I lived there for a long time. I have a lot of friends there. But this next century is going to be a new American century. We are going to let that pendulum that went so far to one side swing back. And I think that for American companies, there's going to be some rough, turbulent water. at the end, our self-sufficiency will rise, our resilience, and this has been one of the great American strengths that is always underestimated by everyone else on the planet. Our resilience, our temperance, our commitment, and once roused to fix things, we fix things. And this will get fixed too. Hopefully those of you that are taking the time to graciously spend some time with us are a little bit ahead of the curve of the folks that haven't had this, because we're really not seeing this information many places. It still blows my mind this isn't on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but they're preoccupied with other things, but we're not. Dennis?
It's hard to top what you just said, David. I just want to say one thing. I was born in Pennsylvania. I love Pennsylvania. It's not only beautiful, but I think it's the best state in the United States. I love it. And I think that we have a great history of manufacturing and making America what it is today. Pittsburgh, for those of you in the East, is in the West. You used the Lewis and Clark got on a little raft and went all the way out to the Pacific coast. I think this will be not only a great time coming up for America, but I think there's tremendous potential there for our state, and I hope it happens. Now, we've spent the last 55 minutes talking to you. I hope we've said a few things that you find are interesting. I want to thank Tina again and Leanne for, allowing us onto your computers or onto your phones. So we will now sit here and answer any questions, Leanne, that people have for as long as they want. But from David and myself, thank you very much.
And Dennis, we do have a question that came in on chat for you. What's your estimate of how long the pain's going to last? Is it 3 to 5? Is it shorter? Is it longer? What do you think is the period of this transition?
The short-term answer is at least 9 to 12 months. I think that the realignment that's going to start coming out of China is going to continue for the next 4 to 5 years. The one thing that David said that I want to reemphasize here is, if your company is at all at risk, depending on what we said here today, don't wait. Do something now. Begin your evaluation of your company and your suppliers, either by yourselves internally or with people from the outside helping you. But this is not a short-term problem. I think 5 years from now, we'll look back and say, 2020 was really pretty great, because I think it incentivized us or forced us as a country and as a state to move forward. But there is no short-term solution to this. David, do you have anything to add?
No, I concur completely. And there was a question also came across. Is there a resource to find out if a Chinese company is now closed?
You can answer that. That you can answer.
Well, there is a resource, but it's not going to be a good answer for you. Coach John Wooden of Boston Celtics fame was once asked years ago, with all these new analytical tools and analyzing players and stats, do you have any tools that never fail you? And he said, yes, I've got 2 of them. I call them my right eye and my left eye. And he said, they never let me down. The only way to know is eyeballs. And I hate to say that, but I'm working with some folks now that are in this protective gear business. They're trying to bring masks and other stuff in. They get constant entreaties and contacts. And then they say to me, was this company legit? And I call someone in China and I tell them, drive or take a train, go to the front of the factory. I want a picture. Walk inside and take a picture. Sometimes they're going full blast and it's all legit. Sometimes they don't even exist. It's a storefront. It's somebody else's factory. Unfortunately, there is no reliable, transparent, honest source. And I really hate to say this, but even the factories themselves, if the owner has already decided to close and you call them, they might say, you know what, we're up and going, but we'll put you first in line if you prepay in your next 5 orders. And once that money's gone, you're not getting it back. You might try to get someone that is reliable, maybe someone you've worked with for a long time in the same city, same region, to do some internal due diligence. You might even try the U.S. Commercial Services. They may be able to give you some insight, but at least they'll tell you the truth.
David can't say it, and it's not I have my own firm, I'm different, but you could talk to somebody like David who has people on the ground that he can contact, because in the end of the day, you can't call them because they might say, yes, we're here, here's a bill, and you'll end up that they're not there. And the problem is the situation's only going to get worse. Even if the statistics David gave a few minutes ago of 500,000 bankruptcies in China, even if that's wrong by half, which it isn't, think of 250,000 companies in supply chain no longer available. Are there other questions, Leanne?
Well, one did come in also about Chinese freight costs and long and short term. Short term, my opinion is they're going to stay high. Part of the reason is that air traffic is still swallowed up. Part of the reason is that the ships aren't even moving, or limited volumes. So there's a shortage of capacity. Long term, my guess is it will eventually moderate, and it'll moderate because there's obviously going to be stuff. I mean, we're not predicting that China goes away, but there will be less volume. But those same ships that are right now going from Long Beach to Shanghai or Shenzhen, they're just going to be going down to Phnom Penh. They're going to be going to Bangkok. They're going to be going to ports on the shore of Malaysia, and Singapore as a transshipping point. So they will moderate over time, but I think it's going to take a few years before all of those areas balance out their volumes to be sending fully containerized ships. I mean, that's the key, capacity. When the ships are full, they're efficient. When they're not, prices go up.
And when all of the goods are essentially going one direction and not the other direction, that's why Meyer and the other major shipping companies have simply cut back. They will respond to demand, but do any of you seriously see stronger demand coming for goods in the next 12 to 18 months? I don't.
No. That was on chat, but obviously for Leanne and Tina, if anybody else wants to just unmute and ask, I think we may have had one more come in. Let me take a look. Oh, I'll answer this one, Dennis, and you can follow up. Because China doesn't play with the same rules, how can any U.S.
Can you read the question, Dave? Could you read the question for us so we know what it was? Could you read?
Oh, that's what I'm doing. I'm reading it.
Okay. All right.
The question is, because China doesn't play with the same rules, how can any U.S. manufacturers compete? Plus, millions of young Chinese engineers are graduating every year. Can the U.S. keep innovating? I'm going to give you my real gut level reaction to this. And it's going to take me a little bit of a minute because I need a little bit of a history lesson here. I believe, and this is based on a lifetime spent in international business, we're sitting in the most innovative nation on the planet. And it drives from two things. We have the most phenomenal universities. And let's just start with that. I know Chinese people, every single client of mine, and I mean everyone from China, after they set up their distribution, after they work on their stuff here, the next thing they say is, can you get my kid into a good school? Can you get them into an Ivy? Can you get them into a Caltech? Can you get them into Penn State? Can I get them into Swickley Academy? Can you get them into a local prep school? I don't know anybody that's ever asked me, can you help get my kid into Wuhan Tech? They come here because we dominate in education. That's number one. But the deeper reason, this came to me because when I lived in China, I used to run a class. I taught it in Hong Kong and in my factories and regionally, called Understanding Americans. It's culture. This country was formed by adventurers, fortune seekers, malcontents, weirdos. They were either chasing something or getting chased out. They wanted to make money. Whether they were the pilgrims that were coming to escape persecution or the planters that were coming to plant tobacco, that's who came here. Innovators, risk takers. It's in our guts. These other countries have had thousands of years of emperors and kings, and China in particular. And there's a saying in China, the nail that's fixed up is hammered down. Dissent is crushed. And so we see it politically. We say, oh, well, yeah, if you dissent in China, you're disappeared. It's true. But see, that same mindset carries over into the world of business, and the willingness to have creative destruction, to innovate, for a person to stand up in a factory and say to the boss, we're doing it wrong. I got a new way. We're going to turn this place upside down. That mostly happens here. A little bit in Europe, I'll grant you that for sure. but it does not mostly happen in Asia. They mostly adapt and adopt and perfect. But the innovation is our core and it's our key. So let them keep the old tech. Good luck for it. But I think that this nation, with our educational system and our cultural background of willingness to destroy what we've got for something better, is an enormous strength that gets underplayed when people get too focused on Chinese labor rates. I know I'm on a soapbox, but I love this soapbox.
I think we missed one above that question. It was, how can US-based tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers take advantage of the disruption? How can they best position themselves in front of potential customers?
Dennis, you want to get that one? And
I'll take the first shot. I think for tier 2 and 3 suppliers, this is probably the best opportunity you've ever had to approach US manufacturers in the last 40 years. Let me explain why. The Congress has not been able to do very much in dealing with the coronavirus from a healthcare standpoint, because it's sort of not what they do. But what the Congress is best at doing, in my opinion, is creating opportunities under the tax laws. I predict in the next 3 or 4 months, you will see many, many bills introduced into Congress, which will give tax incentives to US companies that need tier 2 and 3 suppliers for parts, and they're going to be encouraged and incentivized to buy American. And so I actually will probably be on CNBC later this week talking about this, but because of that, I think if you haven't been able to crack a US company that you'd like to supply, or even a European company, I think the tax rules are going to change significantly before the election, which will make this better. And so I would look at my top 4 or 5 possibles, and I'd go out and say, can I meet with you? We think these things are happening. We're a US supplier. We're a little bit more expensive than what you may be getting overseas, but we're reliable. And so that would be my advice. David?
Well, I agree with that completely, and I think the tax laws
You agree completely, yeah, but you said you agree with me completely. You've never done that before, so would you say it one more time?
You want to put a little red check on your calendar, because it's not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
It's not going to happen again.
All right.
I think also that the tax changes are already occurring. I know that in the power distribution equipment business, Trump's White House has already issued an executive order that they will not have federal money spent on large-scale transformers that are manufactured or owned by what they call a foreign adversary. And I have a very good friend that's in that business, and I said, so how many foreign adversaries are there? And he said, one. And so Chinese transformers aren't going to be coming in on any federally funded project, which in power distribution is almost all of them. Even state-funded projects have some federal money in. And even American factories here owned by the Chinese are prohibited. So it's already happening. The second thing is this, and I'm not trying to be self-serving. You know, Dennis and I have presented this to a lot of people. Share this information with the people you want to supply. If you're a tier 2 and 3 supplier and you've been shoved out by the China market, get some of this information in front of the customers you want. Let them know that they could be at risk. At least get you into the mix. At least maybe you are a backup. And if the Chinese side either fails, or the quality sinks, or the political tariff situation becomes untenable, now you're already in the door. Use this information today. And one last thing I'll say on that point, Dennis and I have done these for, as he said, over 1,000 companies. Sometimes it's for organizations like today, Mantec, World Trade Center, and we love this. We want to help our state and our region and our nation. Sometimes out of that, a company comes in and says, will you do a private one for us and our suppliers and our customers? We want our extended chain to hear this. They may have heard it. They want everybody in their chain to hear it. If someone or 2 or 3 here say, you know what, we'd like to do it for, we don't have to have, 100 people or 50 people. We'll do it for 15 people. Get some of your folks above, some below, say, we heard something really interesting. We'd like you to hear it because it may change your thinking, and get ahead of the curve. We're happy to do this for you. And then there was another question that came in, a couple more actually.
Yeah, there's several.
what are the weaknesses in the China market in machining and fabrication? And then I'll cover the last one on education. I'll tackle this one first.
Dave, I think the weaknesses in China we've already talked about. It's financial. The very large companies, for example, the one that supplies the iPhone manufacturing with 1 million employees, they're fine. But a lot of these smaller companies have significant financial drains. That's why a lot of the bankruptcies have been there. And the China is not set up to provide financing for small to medium-sized companies. The big, they're called SOEs, the state-owned state-owned entities. For example, it's Chinachem, the Chinese chemical, or Sinopec, the Chinese oil company. They have the money, but these small companies are simply running out of funding, and that's their long-term weakness. The other thing is they're becoming more expensive. I don't think we touched on this enough. A lot of the reasons that companies, as David's company has been doing for years, taking them out of China, isn't that they just wanted to go out of China, but Chinese labor has gotten really expensive versus Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And so because they're becoming higher cost, and at the same time they don't have the financial resources, that, in my opinion, is their biggest weakness. Dave?
I think also that the smaller companies, that, as Dennis very correctly pointed out, are kind of on the razor's edge. They're being bled. They're really being hurt by the tariffs. And I know there's a lot of press here, about how we're paying the price. Well, maybe, but we're recovering from what we've been doing for 35 years. I think that they don't have the access to get here. The other weakness that they have is in design innovation. The other weakness that they have is the ability to interact with customers and do customizations. I mean, we have to play to our strengths. Our strengths aren't going to be super low cost, high volume, cheap product. That stuff won't actually come back here. That's going to go to Cambodia. Where we are strong is in extremely high quality, precision, customer responsiveness, and those short supply lines that these companies are striving for. You can provide them if you're just cross state or a couple states. So I do think that there, again, are some opportunities there. For sure, people that are in the mold making business should see a heck of a renaissance as the Chinese companies. I mean, there's no way to get your molds out if they're over there right now. There was a note from Kelly about York College and their engineering program. And so, again, this may be another advantage for some of the companies here. I know that it's not the common model now for organizations to sponsor college tuition, but having some folks refreshed and getting up to speed is probably not a bad thing to do, because that's one of our strengths. And there was another question about, Dennis, I'll toss this one your way. When do you estimate business travel will open back up in China?
I don't think business travel, the way it used to be, will ever open up the same in China. Right now, they're having a reemergence of the flu in Wuhan and other parts of China. Basically, it's how many flights will United and Delta put across the Pacific to go to China. They've been cut back by about 60%, even more in some areas. And so I think international travel, not just US-China travel, but I think that the days of jumping on an airplane and just going somewhere for a meeting, they're over. So I would think that international travel is going to be down, at least once we're through the flu crisis, probably down by about 50%, which really is a reason why you need to have people over there or folks who have knowledge about doing business there working for you, because it won't be as easy. But thank you. That's a really good question.
Great question.
Another question,
David,
Dave?
I got one question asked to me directly, but I'm going to answer it. So would you expect protecting U.S. intellectual property to be more and more important if the political and economic situation in China worsens as you predict? Where exactly is the cloud?
I'll do that one.
Okay.
I've written a book on trade secrets that's been published in English, Chinese, and Japanese. And if there's something I understand, it's IP. The Chinese have, from the beginning, taken illegally, stolen, intellectual property. It will not get any better in the future. I think I've actually moved 3 companies out of China and several companies not into China as a lawyer because they had intellectual property that was essentially a trade secret, not a patent. And so as a result, it was impossible to protect that information, because if you get into Chinese courts where you're forced to do, if you have a dispute between a US company in one hand and a Chinese company in the other hand, you're probably going to be in Chinese courts. And if you do, you're probably not going to win. So the biggest threat in the past and continues to be your intellectual property. And one of the reasons you might want to, for example, look at Taiwan. Taiwan used to be the biggest thief in the world for intellectual property in the mid-1980s. They said, if you want it stolen, go to Taipei. No more. Now, if you want to protect your intellectual property, frankly, if you go to Taiwan, which is not part of China, although China thinks it is, the laws there do protect intellectual property. If you go to the Philippines and Malaysia, you have a better chance of protecting your intellectual property than if you are in China. Vietnam, not so much. And so when you're moving out of China or you're considering where to do business other than the US, one of the key questions is, if I have intellectual property, what chance do I have to protect it from being stolen or misused? Thank you. It's a very good question. I'll turn it over to Dave, but that was sort of my sweet spot. David?
Well, Dennis knows this particular topic inside and out. And the only thing that I would add is that, and I've gone on record about this, there's a lot of writing that I've done that's out there in the public domain. I was actually pretty optimistic. You know, I went to China, I lived there, I worked there, and I saw through a series of leadership changes and Deng Xiaoping, and slowly things started, Hu Jintao, slowly going in the right direction. And I was telling friends of mine, look, they are on a long, slow march to respecting intellectual property. They are on a long, slow march to representative government principles. And the entry in the World WTO, they're fantastic. Olympics, this is all not to be denied. I'm sorry to say that turned around with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, as Dennis Unkovic has correctly pointed out, is more powerful than Mao. He's in for life. They've eliminated all term restrictions, and he has conducted a utterly ruthless campaign of destroying his political adversaries. Oddly enough, duped a lot of Westerners and journalists under the theory of eliminating corruption. Right after he got in, he started a purge of there will be no more corruption and we will root it out. Oddly enough, the people that he found to be the most corrupt were his political adversaries, and now they're gone. So there now is, in my inside information, kind of an even stronger official policy to steal whatever you can. It's very unfortunate, but the reality is that's what it is. And I think Dennis is right. It's not going to get better. It's possibly going to get worse. And I think with this current crisis, they are going to be feeling the pinch. I mean, they're going to feel this. They already are. And they're going to double down on what has worked in the past, which is trying to appropriate property. Another question did come in about
one other thing, Dave. Let me just add one other point there. We've talked about it before, but I think it's worth reemphasizing. If the political relationship between China and the United States continues to deteriorate, any protections you have now for your intellectual property in China, which probably aren't very good, are probably going to get worse, because there would be no incentive for a Chinese court or CTAC, which is their international arbitration group, for protecting intellectual property. Thank you. Let me turn it back to you, Dave.
Sure. And there was a question about, and you touched on it actually, Dennis, that what we learned from the Spanish flu 100 years ago is that the second wave is worse. There are varying predictions about whether we will get that. I understand the desire to get the state open certainly affects me too. But I do think that if the states open indiscriminately and people don't continue to practice good hygiene, the second wave could be really devastating. I think that the recommendations we made, particularly the second one about conserving assets, if you had major construction projects that were underway at the end of last year, they all got put off, I would say the time to untarp them and start constructing again might not be June. Give things a little time to sort out, keep your powder dry, and see how things ride out on the second wave. Look, if the folks that are predicting that the worst is behind us are correct, no harm, no foul. If there is a hard second wave, and I believe there is a potential for, the states and the commonwealths to once again be ordered to close, except for whatever is politically deemed non essential. Anybody that has taken the step of not prematurely jumping the gun is going to be in good shape, or better shape, I should say. No easy answer for this. I mean, it's a tough time. And then there was another question from Dan.
I could just mention one thing. My son's a cardiologist and now working with people who have heart transplants. They really don't know, David, what is going on. And so the Spanish flu was the Spanish flu, but I think we're just simply going to have to wait to see what happens. But thank you for the question.
Yep. And then a gentleman named Dan had just noted that, had we covered other countries, Dan, all these slides will be available. And we did talk about the other countries, Latin America, Mexico, but Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, they're all in the mix. The Philippines too. To be honest, not so much Indonesia, except maybe for some really low cost stuff. They've got their own challenges with the islands. And then there was a note that just came in from Steve on a similar note to IP. Do you see
Dave,
US?
could I add one thing on that? We haven't talked about India. I think India's Prime Minister Modi has really been very active. By the way, I had to leave the screen for a minute because I was running out of battery on my computer. Apologize. I didn't leave the building like Elvis. But Modi is trying to make India more attractive. And I think they're changing the laws for foreign direct investment. And so if you're doing business and you're looking for a supplier, India is one country. And now, David, you probably spent a year or two of your life in India. Do you agree that India does have some possibilities?
My first startup was a tech-based company. I went from lawyer to manufacturer, and then I spent about a third of a year for 8 years in India. India is, it's got its own problems. It's got political and religious divisions, and I just hate to say this, but their governmental level corruption is unbelievable. But that said, there are smart entrepreneurs that are making good product there. The technology side is well known. It's not just call centers, but even manufacturing in India is getting better. It definitely deserves to be in the mix, no doubt. But when you look at across this board, and by the way, India generally friendly to the United States and a true democracy, chaotic perhaps, but less likely to have the kind of conflicts we've had with China. And I do think that when you put all of those into the mix between Latin America, Mexico, Canada, as another possible place to look, if there are reasons why it shouldn't be in Pennsylvania. But Pennsylvania is my first choice. And then, Dennis, here's a question for you. On a similar note on the IP question of not what's protected there, do you foresee U.S. export controls becoming more restrictive and making it harder to move IP out?
Yes. I can give a longer answer, but for those on the call who don't understand it, certain things from the United States have a national security interest. And if so, you need a validated export license in order to move those products anywhere, particularly to China. I think the Trump administration will be targeting things that are Chinese. And so I expect export controls to be another area in which the U.S. government will be exercising its power over limiting trade with China. That was a really good question. I could give you a 10-minute answer, but I think that should cover it for now.
Yeah. Again, happy to answer more questions if you think about them later in the slide deck. Everyone will get this.
I saw one other pop up, David, about someone signing. Maybe someone is signing a contract in Europe. Did that show up on your screen? I saw.
It may have been to you privately. Don't.
Oh, okay. Then I.
Yeah,
Let me say this. Before we close up, David and I will be glad to take your calls or to talk with any of you following this seminar if you had something you didn't want to throw up on the board, but for which you wanted, our advice. Obviously, I'm a lawyer and he's a businessman. We'd be glad to work with any of you going forward. But if you want to give us a call, we'll be glad off record, off time to answer your questions.
And I would echo that. I did get a copy of this question. I think we can actually answer this about the that contract, because the question is if there's an issue with a global joint venture that has some European, some Chinese, and so forth. The recommendation in the current contract is arbitration in Singapore. Is that more favorable? And is there a more neutral location? If I'd gone back 2 years ago, I would have said the Hong Kong Arbitration Center or Singapore are both fantastic. Now, Hong Kong, not so much. But the Singapore Center, Citrical, is.
I'm what's called an ICDR arbitrator. There are 400 around the world. It's called the International Center for Dispute Resolution. Part of my time is spent serving as an arbitrator. I want to say three things. David is absolutely right. If you are in China, they would want you to do what's called CIETAC, C-I-E-T-A-C arbitration. You do not want to do CIETAC arbitration because they're primarily arbitrators who are chosen from Chinese companies or Chinese government officials. So my advice in the past, as David just said, was go to Hong Kong. It's called the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center. You can look them up at hkac.org. They were my go-to in contracts probably for the last 20 years. However, with what's going on in Hong Kong today, we don't have time to go into it. There's a thing called the SIAC, Singapore International Arbitration Center. The Chinese, if they're not in China, are usually willing to go to either Hong Kong or Singapore. So my advice, and I actually have an article on this. If anybody's interested, contact me. I'll send it to you later. But the SIAC is a good alternative. 3 reasons. Number one, you have arbitrators who are, for the most part, independent, which is good. Number 2, it's in English. And that is obviously important unless you're fluent in Cantonese or Mandarin. And number 3, when pushed, the Chinese will agree to do their arbitrations in Singapore. The worst advice you can get from a lawyer is have him or her say, look, let's have this arbitrated in the United States of America, in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Harrisburg, and we're going to use the AAA, the American Arbitration Association. If the Chinese sign that contract, you can be sure they'll never show up. And so there's a longer story behind it, but I do think if you're going to have an arbitration internationally, you don't want to have it in China, but you don't want to have it in the US. You want to have it in a more neutral place. There's a thing called the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce. There's a London Board of Arbitration. I can send you an outline on this, but the point is get yourself to a neutral country where the arbitrator is probably going to be independent, and then you come in and they come in and battle it out. That's probably more than you needed to know, but thanks for the question.
And as Tina and Leanne had noted, we're going to have a series of some ebooks that we will share with you. Dennis, if you could, maybe that article on SIAC, we could toss that in as well, because there's some folks that were interested in seeing that. I would also say that, you know, as part of our service to this community that's been put together for today, if you have questions, the contact information is on the slide. Call us, email us. We're not pitching work here. We're happy to answer some questions, give some further insight. If we can be useful down the line, fine. But more importantly, there may be questions you don't want to have in a public forum, or that you'd rather just get, you know, it'll come to you tomorrow morning. Don't feel that you can't reach out and ask, because we're very, very happy to help. Good for our country, good for our state. And really grateful for Tina and Leanne for having put this together and brought us here and an opportunity to share. We hope that for those that may be at some risk, they get ahead of the curve, and those that this is an opportunity, you know, more power to you.
And what we're being paid today by Leanne and Tina is a cup of coffee of any size at the nearest Starbucks. Tina and Leanne, did we? I hope we earned it.
You absolutely did. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you yesterday, and definitely this presentation today. I got some texts of how hilarious the two of you are, but very helpful information as we're seeing in the chat now. Yeah, we appreciate your time as well. if I'm okay to just wrap up now, you done talking?
Thank you very much.
Think we're good.
So again, thank you guys so much. World Trade Center Harrisburg has a few webinars coming up that probably will be a better fit for this group that joined us today. That the United Kingdom and Pennsylvania Trade Partnership webinar is June 8th, and the USMCA and NAFTA webinar is June 18th. We'll include that in the follow-up email. Mantec has communication with Dale Carnegie coming up June 16th, and also maintenance excellence, how that supports your process excellence, June 23rd. Also included, you're going to be getting lots of communications from us because David and Dennis are going to give us resources along the way. At any point you want off this list, just let us know. But you're going to get the follow-up email with the slide deck and the video reminders for those webinars coming up, and then also a questionnaire that Mantec is starting to understand how manufacturers have been affected by this pandemic and the needed resources that we can help you connect with. So look for that as well. We appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. And then as we get these ebooks, we'll send those out, and any articles that they're willing to share. And we might see them again, no promises, but they're constantly thinking and wanting to help out our manufacturing base. So we'll keep them in the loop. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.